right, so I've got an exciting video for you guys today. This video is going to be my best of the year, the best books that I read in the year 2021. And I thought about doing, like a typical like top 10 books of the year or top 20 books of the year or even, like a top 21 books of the year for 2021. But the more I thought about it, like my favorite books that I've read this year have tended to be either fantasy or horror. So I thought that would kind of be a boring list. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to have different best books of the year by genre and category. So this way I have a much bigger variety of books to choose from. And like I said, it's going to be by genre. So let's run down the list of genres real quick. And I've got all the books on the table right here. So best fantasy, best sci-fi, best mystery, best thriller, best horror, best historical fiction, best romance. Taylor Jenkins Reid. Spoiler alert. Best short story collections, best novellas, best nonfiction, and then I've got a couple other categories like best debut, my favorite rereads of the year, biggest surprise, and biggest disappointment. And then at the very end of the video, I'm going to choose my top 2 books of the year, which if you've been following my channel, you can probably already guess what they're going to be. But if you're new, you'll find out soon enough. Anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's go ahead and start off with what's closest to me. So, best fantasy. And oh yeah, and what I'm going to do for all these categories is I'm going to choose my favorite and then a runner-up. So it's going to be a great deal amount of books here. So my favorite fantasy book that I've read this year was so good that I actually read it twice. And that would be The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea, I always forget her name, Andrea Stewart. This book, it's really good. And I read it twice because I reread it in anticipation of reading The Bone Shard Emperor, which I still haven't gotten to yet, which I really need to remedy soon. Hopefully I can get to it soon. But yes, The Bone Shard Daughter, one of the best fantasy debuts I've ever read. Very unique, and I also loved how short it is, because you can get some chunky fantasy books that take a long time to read. But really, this book only takes a few days to get into. And just really unique characters, really unique magic system with the bone shard magic, and very dark at times. And yeah, I just really enjoyed it, and I thought it was a fresh breath of air and very refreshing. And yeah, not easily the best fantasy I've read this year, but definitely the best. And the runner-up, which kind of surprised me because I figured I would have picked it as my favorite. But the more I thought about it, The Bone Shard Daughter was more of a unique read, while Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson wasn't as unique because, it's the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive. Still my second favorite fantasy series of all time. But, once you get kind of deep into a series, like, it loses its uniqueness. But of course, I still loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I absolutely still love the characters, and it's definitely not my favorite in the series. I know a lot of people have kind of poo-pooed on it, and I don't quite understand it. Like, I get the argument that, like, oh, it has a great start and a great ending, but the middle kind of drags. I kind of understand that, but at the same time, like, I just love being with these characters, and whatever they're going to do, I'm just going to follow them. And, but yes, definitely not my favorite, but probably not my least favorite either. Probably my least favorite, even though I still give it 5 stars, is Oathbringer. That one kind of dragged a bit more for me than this one. I really enjoyed it, and obviously, one of the best fantasy books I read this year. But the number 1 spot has to go to The Bone Shard Daughter. And since we just did fantasy, I might as well jump into sci-fi. And this was kind of easy to choose from because I really haven't read that much sci-fi this year. Like, it was basically these 2 books, and like, that was all that was on the table for me. But very early on in the year, I read A History of What Comes Next by Sylvain Neville, which is the first book in Take Them to the Stars, his new trilogy. And this is the same author as the Themis Files, which I've always said is my favorite trilogy of all time. I absolutely love it. This series in this first book isn't quite on the same like epic level as the Themis Files for me, but I still absolutely loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. I'm going to be rereading it in March in anticipation for the second book coming out, which I can't remember the name of the book. Oh man, that sucks. But yes, very, very much enjoyed this one, and I'm going to be rereading it very soon. Fantastic book. And then the runner-up, which I did absolutely love as well. I gave it 4.5 stars. A Memory Called Empire by Arcada Martin. This one, maybe not a surprise, but I heard that it was more like a philosophical read and less action-packed. So I was a little hesitant at first, but I got into it and I really enjoyed the main character and getting into her head. And then you kind of empathize with her because she's kind of put on this planet or this different culture and a lot of culture clashing, and she's kind of figuring out a lot about the world. So there's really interesting world building, and the mystery aspects are very good. And again, another fresh breath of air, and I really enjoyed it. Not quite as much as Sylvain Neville's new book, A History of What Comes Next, but both fantastic sci-fis that I've read. But like I've said, I haven't read a lot of sci-fi this year, so these were kind of the only two I could really pick from. But yes, Sylvain Neville, best sci-fi. Now for my favorite mystery books. This was pretty easy for my favorite, and that would be Lisa Jewell, The Night She Disappeared. Now, if you don't know, Lisa Jewell is one of my all-time favorite authors. She might even be a top 5, because I haven't read anything that hasn't been stellar by her. I've read 7 of her books so far, maybe 8. Either way, like I've given all but one of her books 5 stars, and the one book that I didn't give 5 stars, I gave 4.5 stars. Wasn't quite perfect, but this one was definitely 5 stars. I heavily anticipated read for me, and I was so glad to finally get to it, and I really enjoyed it. Not a lot I can say about it, because for mysteries and thrillers, I definitely like to go into those kind of books knowing very little about it. But for me, Lisa Jewell, like I've said before, her character work is fantastic. The atmosphere she creates in her books is top notch. And while the mystery aspects aren't necessarily the best, like they're sort of predictable, and a lot of the times you can kind of see where it's leading towards, I don't think that's necessarily what she's focusing on. I think she's more focused on creating atmosphere and great character work, and that's why I keep returning to her books, and hopefully she can keep, chucking them out, and I'm going to be reading her books for a very long time. And so yes, 5 stars. And the runner-up was also a fantastic book, a new to me author who I've never read before, one of the very first books that I read this year, which was very good, and that would be The Wife Upstairs by Rachel Hawkins. This book really surprised me. I got it for Book of the Month, and I was just like, it might be good. It turns out it was very good. I gave it 5 stars. It was also one of those deals where a lot of the times with mysteries and thrillers, you can kind of get a bland protagonist so that the reader can kind of insert themselves into the story. With this one, you don't get that at all. You get a very interesting and dynamic main female character who kind of doesn't put up with a lot of crap. She just kind of she's very goal driven, and she's like, I want this, I'm going to do this. I don't care who I have to hurt along the way. Like, I'm just going to do it. And I really enjoyed her character. And the mystery aspect of this book was also very good. I think it's based on Jane Eyre, which I've never read before, so I probably missed a lot of, literary references or whatever. But the main reason why I ended up giving it 5 stars, not only because of the character work and the plot itself, the ending was superb, and I really like and enjoy when an author can have a great open ending. Like you get to the ending and you're like, I think this happened, but maybe there's a possibility that this happened. And I love open endings. I know a lot of people can kind of be frustrated with those, but I really enjoyed it. So this was 5 stars. It could have won out because I did really enjoy it, but honestly, I don't know. I couldn't forgive myself if I didn't give it to Lisa Jewell. I love Lisa Jewell. Both of these are great, but yes, Lisa Jewell, The Night She Disappeared, the best mystery book I've read this year. And now we've got best thriller. And this was kind of difficult because, like, this book, I wasn't quite sure if I could put it in the thriller category or the horror category, but I decided to go with thriller. And I think a lot of people would agree with me. But that would be Stephen King's latest book, Billy Summers. And obviously, if you know anything about my channel, I'm a huge Stephen King fan, and I was, of course, super excited to read this. And of course, the only thing I knew about it was kind of the main premise of Billy Summers as an assassin for hire. That's all I knew about it. That's all I really like to know going into any kind of Stephen King book. I don't like to spoil myself or anything. And I had a fantastic time reading this. Yeah, and it was a very good thriller book. It kind of switches halfway through, and I think for a lot of readers that's gonna hinge their rating. Like they're either gonna love the fact that it goes in a completely different direction that you can't really predict, or they're gonna be like, wait, I just wanted the assassin for hire story, and now I'm getting this other story. But I really enjoyed it, and I know a lot of my friends really enjoyed it as well. Not a perfect book. It's got a slight pacing issue like halfway through when it kind of decides to switch. But yes, 4.5 stars. Fantastic Stephen King book. The best thriller I read all year. And then this one, while also being very good and just, it was a fantastic book, it's also very depressing. So it doesn't have a lot of maybe rereadability factor like Billy Summers does. And that would be Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This, for anyone who doesn't know, the main premise is that these two fathers have to get revenge on the people who murdered their gay sons. And so, very heavy topic and just very heavy themes. While it was very well written, I really enjoyed the writing style and the characters, and the plot was very good. But like I've said, it was very disturbing, a lot of disturbing imagery, and very depressing because, you know, it deals with heavy subject matter. But of course, it was very good. Not quite as enjoyable, though, I will say, as Billy Summers. Although Billy Summers does have some rough scenes in it and some heavy topics. I think Razorblade Tears beats that out. But yes, Billy Summers, the best thriller I've read all year. And of course, I had to include Stephen King on the list, right? And now we have the category for best horror novels. And this one, the top spot was very easy, but then I kind of pulled a mulligan because I was like, well, what's my runner-up going to be? I have 2 runner-ups. I couldn't decide. So, but the first one, as it will not, if you know my channel, this will not be a shock to you. Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. I absolutely love this book. And going into it, the only thing I knew about it was that a little boy gets lost in the woods and he's found a few days later and he's perfectly fine, except that he hears a voice in his head telling him that if he doesn't build a tree house in the middle of the woods by Christmas, everyone he knows will change forever. And that was a very intriguing premise. And of course, this is Jessie May's favorite book of all time. So I wanted to read it for myself and figure out if I was going to like it or not. And of course I did. And even though it's a 700-page chunker of a book with very small font, I read this bad boy in 3 days. I flew through it. I absolutely loved the character work. And I love when authors decide to take risks with their story. And he definitely, about halfway through this book, goes in a direction where you're either going to love it or you're not going to like it. And I ended up really loving it. So definitely the best horror novel I've read this year. And then the 2 books that I really couldn't decide which one I wanted to include, I decided to include both of them. And that would be The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones and another Stephen King book, Later. Yes, I loved both of these books. Both of them get 5 stars from me. I will say, however, that The Only Good Indians left more of an impression on me. Stephen Graham Jones is quickly becoming one of my favorite horror writers, even rivaling, maybe not rivaling, but he's up there now with Stephen King. I absolutely love his writing. Very unique. I had a blast reading this book, and one of the most unique horror experiences I've ever had. I really enjoyed the characters. I really enjoyed the kind of more literary side where we kind of take a step back and really dive into the characters. And the ending to this book, again, I keep using the word unique, but like you're never going to read a book quite like this. And I had a blast reading it. Very unforgettable scenes, I will say. So The Only Good Indians, fantastic. But I also really enjoyed Later, and it's one of the best. I even enjoyed this more than Billy Summers, which I just included in the best thriller category. This is more of a horror. It's on the horror side, maybe not like a straightforward horror story. It's definitely not Hard Case Crime, I'll tell you that. But yes, I really enjoyed the main character of Jamie, and even though like it does kind of have the same general premise as The Sixth Sense, Stephen King definitely goes in a much different direction, and the different plot lines you get with the people using Jamie's ability, I really enjoyed, and definitely one of the better Stephen King books that he's written in the past decade or so. Probably the best book he's written since something like Doohickey, which is one of my all-time favorite Stephen King novels. So yes, very high praise from me. So yes, Later, The Only Good Indians, both great horror novels, but of course, Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky, hands down the best horror novel I've read all year. And the next category is kind of weird for me. It's historical fiction. And when I originally was like coming up with genres to do for this, I was like, did I read any historical fiction at all? And normally when I think of historical fiction, I think of like, I don't know, like World War II or some kind of like war-related story. But the more I thought about it, I did read technically 2 historical fictions that I really absolutely loved. And so and they're both in the 60s, so maybe that'll give y'all a hint of what I'm going after here. The first one, of course, is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I absolutely loved this book, and the audiobook for this is incredible. If you don't know, you get a full cast of narrators to do all of the characters, and I was enthralled the whole way through this book. And of course, me being a music lover and a lover of classic rock specifically, I just completely adored this book. And the moment I finished it, I wanted to reread it. And that's how you know when you've got a good book for you. When you read it and you're like, I want to read this again. But yes, and it is kind of historical fiction. It's loosely based on the band Fleetwood Mac, who is one of the best classic rock bands of all time, and it's kind of a retelling of like Fleetwood Mac releasing a ginormous record, Rumors, which literally all of those songs on that album are radio staples, and it's kind of delving into that, and it's got a lot of band drama, and just, I could talk about this book for days. But yes, Daisy Jones and the Six, technically the best historical fiction book I read. And then again, I don't read a lot of historical fiction, but Quentin Tarantino's new novelization, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, fantastic. If you don't know, Quentin Tarantino is my all-time favorite movie director, and when I heard that he was releasing a novelization of one of my favorite movies by him, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood came out in 2019. I saw it in theaters 3 times, and I absolutely loved it every single time. And the novelization, while it's not perfect, like it's a 4.5-star read, he kind of delves into scenes where like they wouldn't have worked in a movie script or a movie format. So he really dives into the characters and the thoughts, the inner monologues that the characters have. So that was interesting. Sometimes it went a little too far for me. Like Brad Pitt's character, like he literally has like 10 pages or even like 15 pages where he talks about like his favorite movies, and I'm like, did we really need this? But everything else was like fantastic, and I loved diving deeper into the characters and the story. I had a blast reading this. So one of the best, well, really only two. I really couldn't think of anything else, but this was great, but clearly Daisy Jones and the Six, the best historical fiction I've read all year. And then we have the best romance genre, which kind of tongue-in-cheek here because I don't read romance, but Taylor Jenkins Reid, man, I love Taylor Jenkins Reid. I just, like I've said many times on the channel, I love her writing style, I love her character work, and obviously, with Daisy Jones and the Six, one of my favorite books of all time. And then reading other books by her, like Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, Malibu Rising, right? Like those books were great. And they had a little bit of romance elements in them, but mainly just the character work. This one is basically like romance. And like that's the main kind of driving force. What sold me on the book though was the premise of like having a dueling timeline where you follow a woman's perspective and you get to see how her life would have played out like after she makes a certain decision. So you get two timelines, and it's very hard-hitting at times, very funny, and it does kind of revolve around romance, but I think just having the hard-hitting themes and the great character work just really, like, I just love Taylor Jenkins Reid, y'all. So technically the best romance I've read all year. And then like I said, I don't read romance, but I will include this just kind of as a funny joke. You Love Me by Caroline Kepnes. Now, clearly, if you know Joe Goldberg series at all, you know it's about a sociopathic stalker and serial killer who gets attached to women and in a very unhealthy way. And so it's not the best romance, but, and again, this book and this series is just fantastic. Very dark black comedy, very dark scenes, but they're also very funny, and clearly not the best example of like a healthy romance, but I thought it would be fun to throw it in here in the romance category. But yeah, Taylor Jenkins Reid, I'm just going to read whatever she puts out, what in any kind of genre, whether it be historical fiction, romance, hard sci-fi. I don't give a shit. Whatever she writes, I'm going to read. So yeah, maybe in another life, best romance. All right, the next category is best short story collections. Now, normally I try to read a lot of short story collections, but the ones that I've read this year have been mostly rereads, and I've only read one that's new to me. So really the only one I could include here that's not a reread is Haruki Murakami's After the Quake. Now, Haruki Murakami, while he's one of my favorite authors of all time, I mainly love him for his novels. His short stories can be very hit or miss. So I went into this one with very low expectations, and I was pleasantly surprised. And I think there's like 6 or 7 short stories in here. There's one that's kind of just okay, but then the rest are actually really, really good. And it's very short and just fantastic and just very weird, sometimes mundane, but also interesting at the same time. His writing style is very weird to describe to people, but I had a blast reading this. I actually read this on a plane in just one sitting, and I had a blast reading it. And then, just so I can include it on here, one of my favorite short story collections of all time, and yeah, not too much to say about it that I haven't said already. Night Shift by Stephen King. If you didn't know, I have a Discord called the Bookish Drummer Discord, and one of the things we're doing is the Stephen King Short Story Book Club. And we're about halfway through it now, but you can sign up anytime you'd like and do a little bit of catching up, or just, pick and choose whatever short stories you want. And right now, starting in January, we're like I said, we're halfway through. We're gonna be starting Strawberry Spring and The Ledge. So if you want, come join the Bookastronomer Discord. And I feel like I've advertised this a lot lately, but yeah, we've been having a fun time. So, yep, Stephen King Short Story Book Club, Night Shift. Come join us. But yes, the best short story collection, After the Quake by Haruki Murakami. And this was kind of a last minute category that I decided to throw in here. I was thinking, like, what are some really great novellas that I've read this year? And I thought about it because I've been rereading a lot of Stephen King novellas because I think he's a fantastic novella writer. So I was thinking, like, what other novellas have I read this year? So I've got two of them. One is a new all-time favorite, and then another one is just a really good one. Not an all-time favorite, but also very good. And it's another Stephen Graham Jones novel. Surprise, surprise. Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. And like I said, it's a novella, so you can read it in one sitting. I had a fantastic time reading this book, or novella. It was of course, it's horror, if you couldn't tell from the title and the author. But, so it's got a lot of dark and creepy moments, but also very funny, whether it's intentional or not. I'm pretty sure it's intentional, but whether it is or not, I thought it was just a very good dark comedy. And some of the lines in here, I literally just laughed out loud. I was like, this is ridiculous. But again, I had such a great time. Honestly, might be one of, if not my favorite Stephen Graham Jones experience, even though I do think The Only Good Indians is a better book. Night of the Mannequins, I just had so much fun with. So the best novella I've read. And then the other one is also coincidentally horror. Not quite on the same level as Stephen Graham Jones, but I had a fantastic time and fun time reading it. And that would be The Goners by L. Stevenson. I actually buddy read this one evening with Sharon Dwyer, who's fantastic, and we had a fantastic time buddy reading this. And like I said, it's a novella. I think we both read it in about, 3 or 4 hours, and we just had a lot of fun. And it's about basically a serial killer who goes around killing people, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And like I said, the kills in here are very interesting. A lot of the times, it's far-fetched, but it was still very fun to read about. And yep, so The Goners was 4 stars. Fantastic horror novella, but Night of the Mannequins is definitely something I'm going to be rereading a lot. I had so much fun with it, and like I said, you can get through it in one sitting. So the best novella I've read all year. And now we're on to nonfiction, which I really haven't read that much nonfiction this year. I'm going to change that in 2022. I'm going to try to read one nonfiction a month. But really, I think I've only read like 3 nonfiction books, so not too much to choose from, obviously. But luckily, I do have 2 5-star nonfiction books, so let's include those. And this one is a book that I just finished a few days ago, so it's very fresh, and I had a blast reading it, and you'll probably be able to guess why. That would be Beast, John Bonham, and The Rise of Led Zeppelin. If you don't know, Led Zeppelin is my all-time favorite band. John Bonham is my all-time favorite drummer. So, of course, reading a biography about the man himself was a very fun read. I only had, even though I give it 5 stars, I had one little nitpick, just one little nitpick. And it's not even that big a deal. If a non-drummer or non-musician read it, they definitely would not catch it. But it's about my favorite Led Zeppelin song, and it's called The Ocean. Fantastic song. If you've never heard it, go check it out. And it's very unique because the time signature is written in 15/8, and the nitpick is that the author says 17/8, which is wrong. But that's literally the only problem I had with the book. I learned a lot about John Bonham and his kind of childhood and him kind of learning drums, and then how Led Zeppelin kind of formed and kind of the problems and issues. I knew about them, but going into detail about kind of his issues with alcohol, and also just getting some tidbits about the drumming and all of the albums that he played on. I just had so much fun reading this book. And of course, one of the best, or the best nonfiction book I read all year. And then a birthday gift from my good friend Patrick, who you can find on many Discords. Trejo, what's My Life of Crime, Redemption in Hollywood by Danny Trejo. He is a fantastic actor who's in a lot of great movies, and you probably recognize him as sort of like the badass Mexican dude. And he even says that in the book. That's not my word. That's him saying that. He's the badass Mexican dude in a lot of movies. And funny enough, he has, I think, the all-time record for most deaths in Hollywood history, which is very interesting. But he's a very good actor, and I really didn't know anything about him other than he was a good actor. And I learned a lot about his early life, basically, being a criminal and just making a lot of poor decisions. And then he kind of, it's about his redemption. And he had a lot of addiction issues, and he was able to overcome them, and he was able to help a lot of people in his life overcome addiction issues. And just learning about just crazy stuff that he's done, and just all the good that he's done, and like him finally becoming like a well-regarded actor. And it was just a lot of fun reading this. And of course I gave it 5 stars. Fantastic, but of course, like, what else was it going to be for nonfiction? John Bonham, I love this book. So 5 stars, best nonfiction book I read all year. The next category I have for y'all is best debut. Now, I haven't read too many debuts. A lot of them have either been favorite authors of mine or just authors that have published a lot of books. So I haven't read too many debuts, but probably my favorite debut that I've read this year is The Push by Ashley Aldrain. Now, I've talked a lot about this book because it's a rare book that definitely was an emotional gut punch to me. There's a scene about halfway through this book and then a couple lines after that just really got to me and really stuck with me. And other than that, like, very interesting writing style, very interesting main character, and it was just an overall very stellar, stunning debut. And whatever this author publishes in the future, I'm probably going to pick up, because this book was very good. And the rare ability of an author to like get to me that way, I really appreciate. So yes, The Push, best debut of 2021 for me. And then on the fantasy side, we have Winds of Strife by U.G. Gutman. This one, while not perfect, I gave 4 stars. I think for a fantasy debut, one of the best fantasy debuts I've ever read. And also, I always mention it, what a pretty cover. I love the white and the blue and the black. Very stunning cover. But of course, the actual story and the characters and the plot and the very cool magic system based on emotion, very, very good. And yes, not quite as good, I would say, as The Push. I think I gave The Push 4.5 stars. But Winds of Strife, very good fantasy debut. So those are my favorite debuts that I read in 2021. And then on the opposite spectrum of favorite debuts, my favorite rereads. And let's see if I can get them over here. The book that I've reread the most, that I'm sure I've talked about on a lot of my videos in the past few months, Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie I love this book. I read this in middle school when I first joined band and was like learning how to play drums. So I saw the title. I was like, oh, that's a really interesting title. But then you get into the book and it's actually pretty dark for a middle school book because it's about a kid who is like in eighth grade and he's having a good life. He's playing drums. And then his brother gets leukemia and he's got to deal with that. And it's basically like a coming of age story of him basically learning that he's not the center of the universe and that he has to put other people's needs first. And I've reread this book probably like 6 or 7 times. I reread this year on my birthday and absolutely fell in love with it again. And this is going to be an annual read for me. One of my favorite books of all time. And yes, I could talk about this book for a while, so let's put that to the wayside. And then I was going to try to just pick one more, but again, I have another mulligan. We have 2 of my favorite rereads this year. Kings of the Wild and Wonderland. One a fantasy and one a horror. Let's talk about Kings of the Wild first. The main reason I wanted to reread this, other than Kate from the Literary Apothecary having a read-along for it and the author interview, which was very good, by the way. The main reason I wanted to reread this was because I wanted to track all of the classic rock references. So the first time I read this, I did catch a lot of them, but I was reading it so quickly just because I was enthralled with the story and the characters that I really didn't have time to like write them down. The second time reading it this year, though, I had a notebook and I just jotted down like everything I could find. So now I have pages and pages and pages of just random ass classic rock references that he threw into here. Some of them I might be, I'm not like 100% sure on, but either way, like it was a fantastic read, of course, 5 stars. I will sometime in the near future, I'm not going to tell you when, but I don't know, because I don't know when. But sometime in the near future, I'm going to make a video talking about all of the classic rock references. So look for that whenever. And then Wonderland by Zoe Stage. She's quickly becoming one of my all-time, not only favorite horror authors, just authors in general. This one is just a fantastic horror haunted house story. It's kind of a modern retelling of The Shining, where it starts out that way, and then about halfway through, it gets real weird. And I just loved the direction it goes in. I think this book is severely, severely underrated. You go on Goodreads, it has a terrible rating. It's like 3.14 or some kind of bullshit like that. Fantastic book that I wished more people would read and appreciate. I did get Josephina to read this, and she absolutely loved it and agreed with me. So I got one convert. Yes, Zoe Stage, fantastic. I loved rereading this. So Wonderland by Zoe Stage, Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. But of course, Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. Like one of my favorite books of all time that I've been rereading basically every year now. So it had to win, of course, and it will probably win every year. And then for typical end of the year videos, a lot of people like to make, like biggest surprises of the year and biggest disappointments of the year. And I thought about doing that, but looking at my books that I've read, I was like, I didn't really have that many disappointments that I felt the need to talk about. Like most of my disappointments are just books that I end up DNFing that I ultimately forget about. And then surprises, I usually try to pick books that I think I'm going to enjoy, right? So hopefully I'm not too surprised by anything. But I do have examples of both here. And so one of the biggest surprises of the year for me was Piranesi or Piranesi. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it, but it's by Susanna Clark. Got it for Book of the Month. And the reason this was a surprise for me is because her other very famous book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I DNF'd that book about halfway through. It's a chunker of a book. It's like 1,000 pages, and initially I was kind of intrigued, and it did have a lot of a few chapters in it that I did really enjoy. But overall, it was just very tedious and boring for me. So picking up this book, I was pleasantly surprised to see it's like 200 pages. So I was like, okay, well, that fixes the main problem I had with her other book. And I went into it really not knowing anything about it. And I think that's the perfect way to read this book. Like, go into it completely blind and just have an experience, which is what I did. And I think initially when I read it, I gave it 4.5 stars, but the more I thought about it, it has a lot of staying power. And I, like, weeks and weeks after I read it, I just kept thinking about it and like what it meant to me and like what it meant to the main character. And I think it's more of a 5-star read. And it definitely blew my mind of like how much I enjoyed it versus what I kind of expected. And so yeah, I think it's probably the biggest surprise of the year for me. And then biggest disappointment, other than of course like DNFs, right? Because like you don't expect to read a book that you're going to DNF, right? I haven't really DNF'd that many books. I think it's like 10. So there's a little bit of DNFs. But one of the books that I was pretty disappointed with, which I know will probably bother a few people, especially if you're a fan of like Alan from the Library of Alexandria. He praises this series as well as many booktubers. But I really enjoyed Senlin Ascends. But I really was kind of underwhelmed by Arm of the Sphinx. Senlin Ascends, I think I just have the opposite experience with most people. I think most people, they get into the first book and it takes them a long time to get into it. And so they're like, okay, well, it was good. But then they get to the second book and they're like, oh, this is where it gets really good. I kind of had the exact opposite opinion. For me, Senlin Ascends was very good. I gave it 4.5 stars. It took me maybe like a couple chapters to get into it. But after that, I was like, this is really good. I really enjoy Senlin. I really enjoy like rising to the top of the tower. Like I think there's like 3 parts, and like every part you ascend. It's called Senlin Ascends, right? And then you get to the second book, and there's a lot of chapters that are written in different POVs, which initially I very much struggled with because, normally in a first book, it's kind of a promise to the reader, like, okay, this is kind of how the rest of the series is going to be, right? And so the whole first book is written from Senlin's perspective, and I absolutely loved it. And then he still gets most of the screen time here, but you get a lot of different POVs that, while they were good, I really just wanted Senlin. And I know that's an unpopular opinion, but because there's a lot of different characters in here that get perspectives, and a lot of people love them. I was kind of underwhelmed by them, and it's very different from the first book, which kind of bothered me. I will say the very ending of the book was good, and that bumped it up a little bit. But overall, this is kind of like a 2.5, 3-star book, whereas a lot of people give it 5 stars. I was underwhelmed and fairly disappointed, so this was probably one of the biggest disappointments of the year. But let's end on a happy note. Piranesi, biggest surprise, I gave it 5 stars, or initially 4.5 stars, but I think retroactively 5 stars. Fantastic book. And now we'll end the video with my 2 favorite books of the year that I read in 2021. If you're a fan of the channel, you probably have guessed what they are by now. I've already mentioned them in this video. And the only reason I'm going to include 2 on here is because these 2 books in particular have risen to the top, where they're both pretty firm in my top 10 books of all time list. So yeah, these were my favorite books of the year. Let's start with number 2, and that would be Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. I won't go into too much detail because I've already kind of talked about it, but yes, Imaginary Friend. One of, if not the best horror novels I've ever read. Great character work, and I just love when authors decide to take chances and to be risky and to not just write a cookie cutter book. Because it could have gone in a direction where you're like, okay, it could have just went into a typical horror direction, but no, he went into a whole nother playing field, and I really liked it. And I know a lot of people struggle with this book, but I absolutely love this book. So 5 stars, obviously, and somewhere in my top 10 books of all time. I don't know what number, but yes, Imaginary Friend. And then my number 1 favorite book of the year, not by far, but man, very good. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And not only is this a top 5 favorite book for me all time, Taylor Jenkins Reid is quickly rising to the top of my favorite authors list. Definitely, what can I say about her that I haven't already said? Oh man, Daisy Jones and the Six. I've talked about this book so many times. Like, I love the audiobook, I love the characters, I love the band drama, I love the classic rock stuff. It's like a flawless book for me, and I had so much fun reading this. And it's one of those books where, like, just I had a smile on my face the whole time reading it. It's definitely a book I'm going to be rereading every year for the rest of my life. Fantastic. Best book of the year by far for me in 2021. Daisy Jones and the Six. All right, so those are my favorite books that I've read this year in 2021 in a whole shit ton of categories for y'all, different genres and categories. Hopefully I'm not forgetting anything major that I've read that I really enjoyed that I couldn't fit into any of these categories. I think this is a good variety. Whereas if I would have done like my top 10 or top 20, a lot of these books probably wouldn't have been mentioned at all. So I'm glad that I decided to do it this way. All right, here's what I'm going to do, just so I cover all of my bases and I don't forget anything that I felt like I could mention here in my favorite books of the year. I'm going to quickly mention some honorable mentions. So I recently finished Michael J. Sullivan's prequel series to Rhaenyra, Legends of the First Empire, and I read books 2 through 6 this year. And probably my favorite book was Age of War, but the whole series in general is just one of my all-time favorite fantasy series, so I'd be amiss if I didn't mention that, at least very quickly. Along those same lines, I've been reading through Song of the Shattered Sand series, and I reread books 1 and 2, which were great, and then book 3 was also very good, 4.5 stars. I've got 2 books left in that series. I'll finish that in 2022. Wanted to quickly mention that. And then Vicious, I absolutely loved this book, and honestly, I wanted to include it on this list, but I really didn't know what category to put it under. Like, is it fantasy? Is it sci-fi? I don't know, but I had a blast reading this, so quickly mention that real quick. And then Burning God, fantastic book, but also the ending wasn't particularly to my taste. I wish it would have ended a little bit differently, but still a 5-star book. But I couldn't quite put it in favorite fantasy when I've had those other twos. Rhythm of War and Bone Shard Daughter, not quite on the same level, but quickly mention that here. Also Zoe Stage, Getaway, again, one of my new favorite authors. This one wasn't quite as good as Baby Teeth or Wonderland. More of a thriller, honestly, but still, fantastic, 4.5 stars. Quickly mention that here. And then a very recent book that was gifted to me by my good friend Joanna, Krampus. I had a blast reading this book, 5 stars, and it's basically Krampus versus Santa Claus. And yes, I had a fantastic time reading this. So it's a good December-related book to end on. So yeah, all of those have been my favorite books of the year. And that's kind of my year in a nutshell. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And of course, please let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know what you thought about them down below. Or if you're interested in reading any of these, let me know. And also just in general, what have been your favorite books that you've read in 2021? and maybe your least favorite books too. I'd be interested to hear those in the comments below, so please feel free to leave it down and I will for sure read about it. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookish Drummer Discord. Thank you guys so much for watching. I've had a fantastic year in 2021 doing the Bookish Drummer channel and the Discord, and just it's exceeded my expectations. Like, I think I've said before that like my goal was to hit 100 subscribers, and we're actually almost to 600 now, which just baffles me every time that I get a new milestone. I've just had a blast. I've made a lot of great friends, and I've read a ton of great books, and I know I'm getting very sappy here at the end here, but I've just had a blast, and I'm going to continue it in 2022 as long as I still have fun doing it, which I like I said, I've had a great time. So yeah, thank you so much for watching as always, and have a wonderful new year. I hope you all had a great Christmas. Thank you so much.